Hello, everyone. I hope that these recordings will be helpful for you. This is the muscular system chapter. Okay, so here in the introduction, this is talking about the different types of muscle tissue that we already learned about. And so, if you remember, skeletal muscle is voluntary, and so it is consciously controlled, and skeletal muscle is attached to the bones of the skeleton. Cardiac muscle is found in the walls of the heart, and this one is involuntary. You cannot consciously control it. But yeah, so this is responsible, of course, for pumping the blood inside the heart. Then the smooth muscle is found in the walls of the internal organs. Um, so this is for the blood vessels as well, inside the walls of the stomach, the small intestine, large intestine. And smooth muscle is instead involuntary. This slide is showing us the structure of a muscle. And so what we're seeing here, um, this whole thing is one skeletal muscle. And this is showing how a skeletal muscle is covered by this connective tissue called the epimysium. So the epimysium allows for the protection of the muscle. Okay, so we're going to underline here surrounds the whole muscle. Then the epimysium is also going to form tendons. And so they put here, and so the tendons are white, but so the epimysium is actually a light colored connective tissue laying on top of the muscle. Okay, now next, we're seeing on this picture how there are these rods inside the muscles. And so they took out this part here. So these rods, each of these rods that are inside, and you can also see this from the pictures here, or these circles on the picture. Each of these is called a fascicle, or a fascicle is also known as a bundle of cells. Surrounding each fascicle is a connective tissue called a perimysium. So I'm underlining here, perimysium surrounds fascicles. So the fascicles, I know it's going to sound very strange, but when you eat shredded chicken, so the little strings inside, so those are actually the fascicles that you're seeing. So it's the same thing for our muscles. Okay, so that inside these fascicles, these rods, there are even thinner rods, and these thinner rods are called the muscle fibers. And so they took out one of these here to show that there are even smaller rods inside. So then surrounding each muscle fiber, and also let me say this here, each muscle fiber is also known as a muscle cell. So the endomysium is the connective tissue that surrounds the muscle fibers or the muscle cells. And so I wanted to just kind of write down here, muscles. Muscles are made up of fascicles, those rods, and the fascicles are made up of muscle fibers or the muscle cells. And so the epimysium surrounds each muscle, perimysium surrounds each fascicle, and the endomysium surrounds each fiber. Okay, so now next, we have to focus on the muscle fibers, because this is showing one muscle fiber. And so again, like I said, skeletal muscle fibers, it's the same thing as a muscle cell. Skeletal muscle cells are multinucleated. We actually learned about this in I believe it was the tissue chapter. Multinucleated meaning it has many nuclei inside each cell. And so nuclei was the plural of nucleus. Now, if you look inside here, inside each muscle fiber, there are even smaller, thinner rods, and these are called myofibrils. Okay, so they cut like in this picture to show how the myofibrils look on the inside, and this is what we're going to focus on. So here in these myofibrils, we're seeing these lines, and we're going to have to learn that these lines are different proteins that will perform muscle contraction. Okay, now one more thing here. Inside muscle fibers, and remember these are cells, there is a structure called the sarcoplasmic reticulum. And the sarcoplasmic reticulum is a specialized smooth ER. Yeah, so if you remember the function of the smooth ER makes lipids, But inside our muscle cells, the smooth ER, the sarcoplasmic reticulum, its job is to hold calcium. It's a storage site for calcium. Okay, now we're gonna come back to that sarcoplasmic reticulum. We're gonna talk about it a lot. Okay, but now next we need to focus on the myofibrils. And we're gonna focus on these lines that these myofibrils have. Now I'm going to draw a myofibril and the components within it. Okay, so here is a rod. On the myofibrils, there are these zigzaggy lines. These are called the Z-discs, or the Z-lines. Label that there. The region between the Z-lines is called a sarcomere. So here's one sarcomere, here's another sarcomere. Sarcomeres are the structural and functional units of contraction. In the sarcomeres, there are these thin lines. These are extending from the Z-discs or the Z-lines. Then in the middle, there are thicker ones. And so these are just made up of proteins. Okay, so I'll do it on this one too. And of course, there are many of these filaments. I'm just adding a few here. Okay, so now let's label these. Thin filaments. Thin filaments are made up of the actin protein. And the thicker ones are the thick filaments. And the thick filaments are made up of myosin. These thick filaments are held in place by a connective tissue called the M-line. Okay, so here this is showing the myofibril, and so here it's labeled myofibril. So we learned that these zigzaggy lines are the Z-discs or the Z-lines. Here it says the thick filaments. Thick filaments are the thicker filaments in the middle. And the thin filaments are those thinner lines, those blue lines, which are made up of the actin protein. The regions on the myofibrils is what is listed on the slide. Oh, and just not forget, here it says sarcomeres are the structural and the contractile units between the Z lines. Okay, so for the regions, it says here the I band. I band is the region where you only see the thin filaments. So for example, if you look at this region here, this region only has thin filaments, but you do not see any thick filaments here. If there are only thin filaments in this region, it's called the I band. The A band has both the thick and the thin filaments. So we can find these regions here on the picture. You can see here both the thick and the thin. So this region would be called the A. The A band, the A region. I remember this by thinking thick and thin filaments, so and A, if that helps. The H zone or the H band, H region, this region only has the thick filaments. And so if you look here, this part is the middle region in the sarcomere. Okay, the Z lines we already went over, and the M line is what I labeled on the previous picture. M line is the middle attachment for the thick filaments. Slide here, this is just showing just more pictures showing these regions. That top picture there, this is showing the microscopic view of the sarcomere, and so in this one we're seeing the thin lines and the thicker lines. So again, the I band, this is the lighter band. This is composed of the thin filaments. The A band has both the thick and the thin. The H zone only has the thick. Z lines were the zigzaggy lines there at the border of the sarcomeres. And the M line is the tissue that holds the the thick filaments in place. And so here, this line is the M line. Next, we have to look more closely at these filaments. So here, this is talking about the thick filaments and the thin filaments. Okay, so here the purple with these things that are sticking out, this whole thing is the thick filament. But so a thick filament, we already said that it's made up of the myosin protein. But so one myosin protein looks like this. Okay, it's actually got two of these shapes there. And so many of these myosin proteins have attached to each other, and it is now formed into this thick filament. Okay, so myosin, these parts that are sticking out, those are called the heads of myosin. And the part of the myosin that is long is called the tail. But so you can see here how the heads are sticking up or out, but the tails of the myosins are making the bulk of the thick filament. Okay, then next, the thin filaments. So the thin filaments are made up of primarily of actin protein. Now in this picture, these light colored circles, or these spherical shapes, those are the actin proteins. But it's not just the actin protein that is located on the thin filaments. There are two other proteins. There's also troponin and tropomyosin. Now in this picture, and they labeled it over here, on the next slide we're going to see a better picture of this. Tropomyosin is this long rope-like shape, or this protein that sits on top of the thin filaments. Okay, but then the troponins. Troponins are these smaller proteins that are attached to the tropomyosins, and they're also sitting on top of these thin filaments. Okay, so if you look over here on the next slide, here we're seeing the thin filaments up close. Now these blueberry shapes, each of these is an actin protein. And if you notice here, they have these dark spots on them. These dark spots are where myosin proteins are going to attach and then pull. So I'm labeling here, these are the myosin attachment sites. But right now, these active binding sites are covered by the tropomyosin protein, which is this rope-like protein. And we're also seeing the troponin proteins here. They're kind of like buttons. Right, but once calcium comes in, calcium attaches to the troponins. So here they labeled calcium bound to troponin. Once calcium attaches to troponin, then the tropomyosin moves away, and now the binding sites are available. Okay, so now next, watch the video that I have put the link